Welcome to the midnight hour. Tonight we step into a freezing Chicago night. Stop, do not get in that car. Sophia's voice tore through the bitter air, freezing Luca DeSantis a few steps from his sedan. For one heartbeat. Nobody moved. Then the car erupted. A white-hot blast lifted the sedan off the ground and slammed fire across the block. Sophia hit the pavement hard, palms scraping against ice and concrete. Through the smoke, Luca stared at her, stunned alive by seconds. Her feet were numb after an 11-hour shift, but fear had burned the exhaustion clean out of her. She had no idea that one scream had just pulled her out of one life and thrown her into another. Belvita was the kind of upscale restaurant where the menus had no prices, and the wine list looked like a mortgage application. 14 months there had taught Sophia two things. Guilty rich people tipped badly, and the body often noticed danger before the mind could explain it. She knew how to read a room. She could feel when a table was about to explode, when a husband was lying, when a man with too much money wanted privacy for the wrong reasons. At 11:47 on Tuesday night, while clearing dessert plates from table 9, that old warning rose in her chest. The room had gone tight, too quiet in the wrong places. Rain, the normally calm hostess, stood near the entrance, with her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. Sophia stacked plates onto her tray, eyes on the door. 3 men walked in without asking for a table. One drifted toward the bar. Another took the hallway to the private room, and the third stayed near the entrance, watching everything. Then Luca DeSantis crossed the threshold. His name was never spoken loudly in Chicago. At 41, he moved with the steady confidence of a man used to people stepping aside. No one in the dining room needed to be told he was dangerous. The room understood it on its own. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, dressed in a black suit cut so sharply it seemed almost severe. His collar was open just enough to reveal tattoos climbing the side of his neck. His face was hard, but not empty. That surprised Sophia. He did not look like the monster whispered about by cooks and valets. He looked tired, controlled, and deadly in a way that did not need proving. As he crossed toward the private room with his guards, Sophia turned back to her tables and told herself it had nothing to do with her. She had served politicians, judges and men who spent $20,000 on wine. Belvita had taught her to see power up close and keep walking. 8 men sat inside the private room. Sophia recognized 2 aldermen, a real estate mogul, and a federal port authority supervisor who had once snapped at her over sparkling water. Moving around the table with bread and water, she made herself forgettable. Waitresses survived by becoming part of the furniture. Still, she heard enough. Ports, permits, shipments, timelines. Whenever Luca spoke, the others sat straighter, back in the kitchen. Marco, the floor manager and the closest thing Belvita had to a conscience, pulled her aside. "Keep the glasses full in there," he said. "No delays tonight." Sophia frowned. "I know how to do my job." Marco looked toward the private door. "I know, just do it smoother than usual." Marco kept glancing toward the private door, his face tight in a way Sophia had never seen. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Fine," he murmured. "Just keep it quiet, Sophia. Very quiet." Then he walked away before she could ask anything else. At 11:31, the meeting began to break apart. The alderman left first, smiling too hard and shaking hands too quickly. The developer followed, already buried in his phone. Last came the Port Authority supervisor, walking alone, pale and hunched as if someone had taken something from him. Sophia watched him pass. People told the truth when they thought nobody important was looking. Luca emerged with his guards on either side. He stopped near the bar, spoke a low command to one of them, then moved toward the exit, Sophia carrying a tray of empty glasses. Past the Valley Station, Danny was there, a 22-year-old kid who worked 3 shifts a week and always looked as if he was apologizing for existing. Tonight he looked sick. He held a set of car keys in one trembling hand and stared at the front door. Sweat dampened his collar even though the air outside was below freezing. Sophia slowed. Fear did not always shout. Sometimes it stood under soft restaurant lighting, pretending to be cold. The keys rattled in Danny's fingers. He clenched his fist to stop the sound, opened it, then clenched it again. Sophia told herself to keep walking. It was not her problem. Nothing in Belvita was ever her problem unless it spilled on a tablecloth. She took 3 steps, then stopped. "Danny," she whispered. He jolted so hard he nearly dropped the keys. For 1 second, his face showed pure panic, the kind that belongs to someone already trapped. "Hey, Sophia," he stammered. "It's just cold out. You're inside," she said. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Sophia turned away, then stopped again. Her skin prickled. "Whose keys are those?" she asked. Danny's face emptied. "A guest's." He choked out. "Which guest?" Sophia pressed. His eyes flicked toward the front doors. That was enough. She looked through the window toward the parking structure where Luca's vehicles waited. Earlier, near the private hallway, she had smelled something sharp and chemical there and gone so fast she had dismissed it. Now the memory returned with teeth. Loose wire. Burnt plastic. Danny's wet collar. Luca almost at the door. Sophia felt the pieces snap together before she could explain them. Her hands tightened around the tray. If she was wrong, she would humiliate herself. If she was right, a man was about to die. The heavy ceramic tray slipped from her fingers and shattered across the hardwood. Every head turned. Sophia was already moving. She pushed past the host podium and burst into the freezing night. Luca DeSantis was 6 feet from his sedan, gloved hand reaching for the door handle. "Stop," she screamed, her throat tearing with it. "Do not get in that car." Luca froze. His guards spun toward her, hands dropping toward their weapons. "Something is wrong with the car," she shouted. She grabbed Luca's sleeve and yanked him back with more force than she knew she had. For half a second, his eyes locked on hers. Then he moved. "Get away from it." "Move," Sophia screamed. Luca stepped back, and his guards moved with him, dragging the circle wider. She kept pulling until her shoes slid on the icy pavement. Then the night split open. The blast hit like a wall. Heat slammed into her chest and threw her flat onto the concrete. Sound vanished into a high, painful ring. The sedan twisted in the air, then crashed down in burning metal and black smoke. Glass rained across the street. Sophia could not breathe. She rolled onto one side, coughing, and saw Luca crouched a few feet away, ash across his suit. Alive, the door handle he had almost touched was gone. The street fell into chaos. Someone inside Belvita screamed. Car alarms howled. Shattered glass glittered across the pavement like ice. Luca crouched in the smoke, one hand braced on the ground. Blood ran from a cut along his jaw, dark against ash and skin. But he seemed not to notice. His eyes found Sophia with a focus that made the rest of the world feel distant. "You're bleeding," she whispered, though her own hands were shaking badly. "I know," he said, voice low and rough. "Are you hurt?" The question startled her. A car had exploded beside him, and he was studying her like she was the emergency. "The valet," she stammered, pushing herself up on one elbow. "Danny, he was holding your keys." Sweating, staring at the door like he was waiting for this. The chemical smell came back again, sharper now in memory, and near the private hallway earlier. There was a smell, like burned plastic or solvent. Luca listened without interrupting. Something cold moved behind his eyes. "Where is he now?" "I don't know." Luca stood and gave a short command to one guard, who disappeared into the smoke. Then he turned back to Sophia. "Can you stand?" She rose on trembling knees. Behind them, flames climbed where the sedan had been. "Someone tried to kill you," Sophia said, looking from Luca to the burning wreck. Her voice sounded too calm, even to herself. "Someone who knew where you would be. Someone who had access to your car." Luca studied her. "You are a waitress, and you're alive because of it," she snapped. A flicker crossed his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Come inside," he said. "The police will be here in 4 minutes. You do not want to be standing beside me when they arrive. I didn't do anything wrong. That will not matter tonight." His gaze hardened. You were next to me when my car exploded. That already makes you part of this. She should have said no. She should have gone home to her small apartment, to the eviction notices hidden under a stack of takeout menus, and pretended this had never happened. Instead, she looked at the flames. Then at Luca. You have 4 minutes, she said. Start talking. He led her through a side door into a quiet corner of the kitchen untouched by the blast. The staff had fled. Fluorescent lights hummed above empty steel counters, while sirens grew louder outside. Luca leaned against the counter, pressing a cloth to his jaw. Tonight was a negotiation, he said. Ports, routes, licenses, money people kill over. Sophia stared at him. And someone decided killing you was cheaper. 3 groups want me out of Chicago, Luca said. One has the money for a bomb. One has the reach to place someone inside Belvita. His gaze sharpened. Tell me about Danny. Sophia swallowed. Quiet, polite. The kind of kid people overlook. His girlfriend is sick. Everyone knows the bills are crushing him. The realization hit her before she finished speaking. They used his debt. Luca nodded once. That is how desperate people get turned into tools. That's a horrible thing to say. It's a horrible thing to do, he replied. Outside, sirens screamed closer. Sophia thought of Danny shaking hands and felt anger rise through the fear. Is Danny going to be okay? She asked. Luca's expression closed. That depends on what he tells us. He's 22, Sophia said. He was scared. Someone pushed him. Luca looked at the floor. And for the first time that night, something almost human crossed his face. I know what that looks like. The words landed quietly between them. Then a hard knock rattled the door. Police. Sophia's breath caught. What do I tell them? The truth, Luca said. Except you were not in the private room. She stared at him. You want me to lie? I want you alive. Those are not always the same instruction. Lowering his voice. The people who built that bomb may have ears inside the department. If your name reaches them as the woman who saved me, you become loose end number 1. Sophia felt the room shrink around her. She had spent years worrying about rent, late fees, and whether she could stretch groceries to Friday. Now men she had never met might be deciding whether she should disappear. They already know my name, she whispered. If your people know what happened, someone else will soon enough. Luca nodded. Then come with me. She held his gaze, refusing to be carried by fear alone. I have a job. Even as she said it, she knew how small that sounded beside a bomb. I have a life, Sophia said. But the image of the eviction notice flashed in her mind. 11 days left. That was all the stability she had. Luca watched her without pity. I will not force you, he said, but to whoever set that bomb. You are now a liability. She gave a sharp, humorless laugh. And getting into a car with you is safer. My car exploded, he said dryly. We will take another one. For one absurd second. She almost laughed. Then the siren stopped outside. Doors slammed. Voices rose. Sophia understood that the old shape of her life had already cracked. The only question was where she would stand when it broke open. She closed her eyes and thought of the faded photograph in her purse. Her grandmother's hand on her shoulder. Both of them squinting into summer light outside the bakery they lost. That memory steadied her. When she opened her eyes, her voice was calm. One condition. Danny lives. I'm not saying he walks away clean, but he was cornered by men who knew exactly where to press. Luca watched her closely. You bargain for a man who may have helped kill me. I bargain for a scared kid who did not know how to get out. His face shifted. Just slightly. You have my word. Sophia believed him before she wanted to. They slipped out through the rear service exit into the brutal Chicago cold. Sophia had left her coat behind, but she did not turn back. In the alley, an unmarked sedan waited with the engine running. Luca opened the back door but did not touch her. That mattered more than she expected. She got in on her own. As the car pulled away, she kept her eyes straight ahead and refused to look at the burning remains of Belvita's perfect evening. Her hand shook in her lap, beside her. Luca spoke in a low foreign language into his phone, every word clipped and controlled. Sophia breathed slowly and counted the streetlights until her pulse began to obey her again. Luca pressed a blood-stained cloth to his jaw, eyes fixed on the passing neon. Sophia watched the dark street slide by and wondered whether she had just made the smartest decision of her life or the last normal one. Danny's terrified face would not leave her. Neither would the smell of chemicals in the hallway. Her instincts had saved Luca, but instincts did not explain what came next. Behind them, 2 miles away, the embers of the destroyed sedan dimmed under the flashing lights of police cars. Across the city, in a windowless office, a telephone began to ring. A man picked it up, listened and said only 2 words, "Find her." In that distant office, Dragan Vujic listened to the report without moving. Luca had survived, and a waitress had interfered. Vujic did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Name, address, family, everything," he said, then hung up as if ordering dinner. Meanwhile, Sophia stood on the 43rd floor of a quiet penthouse, still smelling of smoke and frying oil. It was not the gilded fortress she expected, but a spare, silent space with tall windows looking over the city. An heavy-set guard with tired eyes pointed her toward a bedroom. "Stay away from the glass," he said, sitting on the edge of the mattress in her stained uniform. Sophia pressed her palms against her thighs until they stopped shaking. Sleep was impossible. After 3 a.m, low voices moved through the walls. Luca and his men, speaking in the sharp rhythm of people trying to keep a disaster from multiplying. Sophia leaned against the headboard and finally understood the size of the danger. She changed into a gray sweatshirt someone had left folded on a chair and placed her old uniform neatly on the bed, as if order could still mean something. In the cold kitchen, she brewed coffee because her hands needed a task. When Luca entered at 3:47, sleeves rolled up and jaw bandaged, she met his exhausted eyes. "I made enough for everyone," she said. Luca looked at the coffee pot as if it had no right to exist in the middle of a manhunt. Then he poured a cup and stayed on the far side of the kitchen. "Did you sleep?" he asked. Sophia shook her head. Good, there was no sarcasm in it. Over the rim of her mug, she asked what he had found. He hesitated, then seemed to decide something. Military-grade explosive. Wired to the ignition between 9 and 11. Sophia remembered a name she had overheard near the private room. The Serbians. Luca's eyes lifted, sharp with surprise. "You heard that? Waitresses hear everything." He nodded slowly. "Then you understand more than most people in that room did," Luca said. The Serbian syndicate had been pushing into American ports, using shell companies, casinos and men with clean hands on dirty payrolls. At the center was Dragan Vujic, a patient man who preferred leverage to noise. They wanted shipping lanes tied to Luca's network. This time, they had reached through Danny Reyes, a valet with a clean record, $42,000 in medical debt, a girlfriend whose treatments cost $8,000 a month. Sophia felt a dull ache under her ribs. "How do you know the exact numbers?" she asked. Luca's expression did not change. "Because I find every secret before someone uses it against me." He set the cup down. "Danny is being held. He is alive." The kitchen went still. Luca explained that Vujic's people had approached Danny 3 weeks earlier and offered him $50,000 to plant what they called a tracker. He didn't know it was a bomb. Sophia whispered. "He suspected something," Luca said. But they had his girlfriend's address, photos of her clinic, her schedule. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment. Danny had not been innocent. Not completely. But he had been terrified, and terror made people choose from terrible options. "What happens to him?" she asked. "He talks. Then he disappears under a new name with enough money for medical care." Luca's voice was hard. "That is the mercy I can offer." Sophia hated how much relief she felt. She said, the words bare and honest. Then she asked the question that had been sitting between them since the car pulled away. "Am I a prisoner here?" Luca watched her over the steam from his coffee. "No, you can leave. But within 24 hours, Vujic will know you are unprotected." "You don't trust me," he added. "I don't know you." she corrected. Those are different. A faint look crossed his face, as if he respected the distinction. Then tell me, Sophia said, if I stay, what does my life actually look like? She needed rules. Fear was easier to face when it had edges. It means you have security, Luca said. You go nowhere alone. You do not use your phone except through hours. You do not return to your apartment until I say it is safe. Sophia stared at him. That sounds a lot like a cage. It is a locked door with guards on the right side. And what do you get out of it? He frowned. This is not a negotiation. Everything is a negotiation. If you keep me alive only because you feel guilty, that is weak. Luca was silent for a long moment. It is not guilt. Then what? He looked at her, and the honesty in his answer surprised her. I don't know yet. At 4 a.m, while Chicago slept, they sat in the dark with bitter coffee cooling between them. Neither of them trusted easily, but both knew they had crossed a line they could not uncross. By dawn, the papers showed the damage outside Belvita. Scorched pavement, broken windows, twisted metal where a luxury sedan had been. Her name was not printed, which should have comforted her. It did not. Holding Luca's secured phone, she called in sick for the first time in more than a year. The manager's voice was cold and careful. Belvita was closed for repairs, he said. He did not ask if she was all right. After hanging up, Sophia stared at the blank screen and began calculating rent. 11 days had become a joke with no punchline. Luca appeared in the doorway with 2 guards behind him. I have a proposal, he said. You can refuse. Sophia looked up. That's twice now you've mentioned choice. Most men in your position don't bother, for the first time. Luca sat across from her without looking like he was holding court. The bounty went live at dawn, he said. $100,000. The target is you. They want you alive because they want to know what you saw, what you heard, and what I told you. Sophia felt the room tilt slightly. $100,000, she whispered. The number sounded unreal, almost vulgar. Why me and not you? Luca's answer came without hesitation. They failed to kill me. Now Vujic will try to control me through someone weaker. I'm the bait. You're a variable. That is not better. He did not pretend it was. Sophia thought of her apartment, the eviction notice, the grocery receipts folded into envelopes. She had spent years living with numbers that decided what she could eat, where she could sleep, and how long she could keep pretending things were fine. Now a different number had been placed on her life. She was tired of being priced by other people. What do you want from me? She asked. It took 3 refusals before her defenses started to bend. The first no came from fear. The second came from common sense. The third was quieter, because she had already started listening. Luca wanted her to run Carina, a failing 3-story restaurant on the north side. 200 covers. A kitchen that had burned through 4 head chefs in less than 2 years. Bad systems. Worse morale. Good location. You want to hide me in a restaurant? Sophia asked. I want you somewhere secure that I control, he said. And I want Carina to stop losing $40,000 a month, despite everything. She almost smiled. There it is. The kitchen is sound. The room can work, Luca said. The problem is leadership. Someone needs to understand food, timing, staff, and pressure. You have 9 years in restaurants. Sophia, you were unofficially running half of Belvita. Her eyes narrowed. You checked my history. I checked everything. That should make me angry. It should make you informed. She hated that the answer was practical. So I run a kitchen with a bounty on my head. Luca leaned closer. You work in a protected building, surrounded by my people, doing something useful instead of sitting in a penthouse waiting to be hunted. He paused. And yes, I want the losses to stop. Full operational control, Sophia said. Hiring, menus, suppliers. No interference from you or your men unless it is a security issue. Luca nodded. Done, a real contract. On paper, done. My name stays off anything that ties directly to you. Already planned. She studied him. then named a salary that made her stomach twist with guilt. Luca did not even blink. Later she would realize she had still negotiated like a woman, counting pennies under bad kitchen light. In that moment, the number felt enormous. Luca simply said, "Done." Sophia exhaled through her nose. "You are very annoying to bargain with. I have heard worse." Sophia let the silence settle, then met his eyes. "I want the full truth. No edits if men like Vuich are putting bounties on me. I need to see the board. I can't survive if you keep me in the dark." Luca weighed the risk. She could see him doing it. Telling her too much could make her dangerous. Telling her too little could get her killed. At last he nodded. "You will hear what I hear." That promise changed the shape of the room. Her first week at Karina nearly broke her anyway. Not because of the men hunting her. Because the kitchen itself was a disaster wearing an apron. On her first morning, Sophia stood in the prep kitchen with her hands on cold stainless steel and whispered, one task at a time. The place was rotting from the inside. A defeated crew. Unreliable suppliers. A menu too big for a kitchen that could barely breathe. She attacked the mess piece by piece. On Monday, she fired the sous chef who bullied line cooks and blamed everyone else. On Tuesday, she cut 3 suppliers and renegotiated with 2 others. On Wednesday, she spent 6 hours rebuilding the prep schedule. By Friday, the kitchen no longer felt like a fistfight. It was not smooth, not yet, but for the first time, it had rhythm. By Friday night, the staff moved with a cautious new confidence. At 9, as steam lifted from the pass, Luca appeared in the shadows. Sophia turned and found him 2 feet away. She flinched, then glared. "Do not come back here unannounced. You scare the staff." A dry smile touched his mouth. "Giving me orders in my own restaurant. I am running the kitchen you handed me." That was the deal. He accepted the correction with a small nod. She handed him a glass of water and walked him through the supplier switch. Cost would rise 8%, but waste would drop enough to cover it. "You read invoices?" he asked. "I read anything that costs me money." Luca watched her with that heavy, unreadable gaze. "You're good at this." "I know," she said. "Do you?" he asked. The question irritated her because it landed somewhere tender. People who know their worth don't stay 11-hour shift for tips while doing management work for free, he said. Sophia looked away. "My grandmother had a bakery," she said after a moment. "An old Italian place. I grew up there. When she died, the bank took it. I spent 3 years trying to buy it back." She laughed once, bitterly. Then bills started winning. Time started winning. At some point, I stopped saying I was trying and just went to work. "I didn't run out of hope," Sophia said. "I ran out of money, then time." Luca did not interrupt. That silence disarmed her more than questions would have. "I was 11 days from eviction the night your car exploded," she said. "You should know that before you decide what kind of person I am. It changes context," he said, "not character." She looked back at him. "You protected Danny Reyes," Luca continued. "A kid you barely knew, after he helped put a bomb under my car. He was used. Most people would not care. Most people have never been desperate enough to understand him." Luca's expression softened, almost painfully. "That is exactly what makes you dangerous." The bounty did not vanish. It shifted through the city like a bad rumor with money behind it. Luca's security team tracked it constantly. 3 times in the first month. Men appeared near Karina and disappeared before anyone could question them. Sophia demanded to know each time, and Luca stopped trying to soften the reports. When he told her the 3rd scout was tied to Vuik, she looked up from inventory. He walked away too quickly. Luca's eyes narrowed. "Explain if he was only watching." "He would have stayed. If he was testing us. He would have pushed closer." Someone pulled him back. Luca studied her in the half-lit corridor behind the kitchen. "What makes you so sure?" "Because he moved like he got new instructions," Sophia said. "That means someone knew where he was and what he was seeing. Someone was managing him in real time." She let the words settle. "You have a leak." Luca's face went hard. "We reached the same conclusion this morning." Then you're late. His jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Someone close. She continued. Close enough to know your patterns. Close enough to have become invisible. For a moment, anger flickered across his face. Then something worse replaced it, grief. I'm sorry, Sophia said softly. Luca looked away, his gaze fixed on the brick wall. The kitchen noise faded behind them. There are men in my circle I've known for 20 years, he said. Men who stood beside me when my brother was buried. It was the first time he had mentioned a brother. Sophia did not push. She had learned that Luca gave the truth in pieces, usually because each piece hurt. We'll find him, she said. He turned back, eyes dark. Yes, he replied. We will for a few seconds. Neither moved. The smell of garlic, wine and hot oil drifted from the kitchen. Outside, danger waited. Inside, something between them had changed. Sophia realized she was looking at a man who had carried grief so long he had mistaken it for discipline. She knew that kind of exhaustion. The kitchen crew began passing by, calling good night as they headed into the cold. Their ordinary voices made the silence after them feel heavier. Luca and Sophia stood in the corridor, not touching, not naming what had begun to form. 40 blocks south. Vuich read the latest surveillance twice. She is still there every night. He is always beside her. He set the phone down and smiled without warmth. She is not only under his protection anymore. Vuich murmured. She is inside his operation. He made a call. Raise it to 200,000. Alive is no longer required. The answer reached Karina at 6:14 the next morning. Sophia was doing inventory when Ren appeared in the kitchen doorway. One look at his face made her set the clipboard down. What happened? North Warehouse on Armitage, he said. 20 minutes ago. Total loss. Fire is still burning. Her stomach turned cold. People too inside. They got out. Bad burns. But alive. Relief hit first. Then the rest of the sentence arrived. The enemy had just burned one of Luca's arteries. Sophia called Luca immediately. He answered on the first ring. For once, his voice did not sound controlled. It sounded hollow. Stay at the restaurant, he said. Do not move. Sophia, I mean it. I'm not going anywhere. Are your people alive? They'll survive. A pause, just stay put. 4 hours later. He arrived at Karina and went straight to the back office without stopping in the kitchen. Sophia followed, shut the door, and watched him sink into a chair with his face in his hands. She had seen him angry. She had seen him cold. This was different. This was a man hit where he had not guarded himself. For a long moment, Luca said nothing. His silence was not strategy this time. It was damage control. Sophia sat across from him and waited. They knew the shift rotation, he said finally. Those guards were not supposed to be there until 7. The schedule changed at midnight on our secure channel. Whoever burned it knew within 2 hours. Sophia felt the meaning settle in her chest. That isn't an old leak. No, that's live access. Luca nodded, staring at the floor. Someone active. Someone with us right now. How many had access? She asked. 6, he said. Including me. Betrayal had entered the room before either of them could name it. Tell me about the 6, Sophia said. Luca looked at her, and she could see the fight in him. Protect the information or protect her with the truth. At last he began. Ren security chief of 10 years. Caruso logistics. 2 coordinators whose names meant little to her. Elena, his 26-year-old assistant. Then he stopped. Sophia waited. Marco Vieri, he said at last, the name heavy in his mouth. My financial advisor. Sophia went still. How long? 16 years. Luca looked sick with it. He was at my mother's funeral. He was the first person I called when Matteo died. Now the brother had a name. Sophia leaned forward, gentle but firm. Has Marco changed recently? Luca's jaw tightened. Slower, distracted. I thought he was tired. He's 63. Has he been gambling? The silence became suffocating. Luca's eyes lifted slowly. Why would you ask that? Because debt is a leash. Because older men get overlooked when they've always been around. Because everyone assumes loyalty from habit. Luca stood and walked to the window, turning his back to her. His shoulders were rigid. 8 months ago, he borrowed $40,000 from me. Said it was for renovations. Did you see the renovations? Sophia asked. He did not turn around, no. Just irregular payments, Luca said. Then the word came from him. Quiet and ugly. Gambling, his face stayed controlled, but Sophia saw the wound in his eyes. He gave the eulogy at my brother's funeral. Luca whispered. He held himself together better than I did. Luca, Sophia said softly. He shook his head once, warning her not to comfort him too soon. Do not tell me this is business, he said, voice rough. This is not business. She believed him. Business was what people called betrayal when they wanted it to sound clean. This was older and deeper than that. This was a knife placed by a trusted hand. When Luca could speak again, he said he would not destroy 16 years on suspicion. Then we find certainty, Sophia said. He tried to keep her out of it, and she pushed until he explained the plan. Each of the 6 gets a different false detail, Luca said. A location, a contact, the time. We watch which lie reaches Vuich. How long? A week? Maybe 10 days. Sophia shook her head. You don't have 10 days. He looked at her. You think he moves sooner. He burned a warehouse to prove he can reach you. Next time he won't warn you with smoke. Luca did not answer because he knew she was right. The ruined warehouse hung over them all day. By then, the bounty on Sophia had risen to 200,000, and the condition had changed. Alive was no longer required. Ren stopped filtering the reports because Sophia caught him every time he tried. At dawn 2 days later, she found the message spray-painted in dripping red across Karina's loading dock. The waitress eyes next. The paint was still wet. Then a delivery van rolled slowly past the alley. Too slow, a red dot crawled across Sophia's apron. Ren slammed into her and drove her behind a dumpster, just as a shot cracked the brick where her chest had been. For 3 seconds, Sophia could not hear anything but the blood in her ears. Ren dragged her inside through the service door, while glass shattered behind them. She called Luca before Ren could stop her. His voice came through already sharp. I'm on my way. No, she said, breathless. Listen first. This was meant to pull you here. Silence then, his voice dropped into something frightening. Who fired? I don't know. Ren, Luca snapped. Ren took the phone. And Sophia heard Luca lose control for half a second. Not loudly, but completely. I want the city closed around him, he said now. Sophia took the phone back. Do not burn Chicago down because I got lucky. He went quiet. You call that lucky? You need to think, Sophia said, forcing her voice steady while her hands shook. Vuich wants you angry. Luca's breathing was rough on the line. He put a sight on you. And missed. Sophia, the way he said her name made Ren look away. Move the timeline, she said. Today. 18 minutes later. Luca arrived anyway. He stepped into the loading dock, saw the bullet mark in the brick, then looked at the tear across her apron. His hand lifted, stopped before touching her chest, and closed into a fist. For one dangerous moment, Sophia saw the man everyone feared. Then he looked at her shaking hands and pulled himself back. The test happens now, he said. Luca gathered the 6 suspects in a dim room on the south side, a place with concrete floors and a 2-way mirror that made everyone look guilty. Sophia stood behind the glass beside Ren, still feeling the ghost of that red dot on her chest. Marco Vieri arrived 3 minutes late in a fine suit that had been pressed too many times. The collar was frayed. His shoes were polished over cracks. Luca began calmly, giving each man a different false detail. To Marco, he mentioned a Serbian contact at a warehouse in Pilsen. The address did not exist. Sophia watched Marco's hands. His fingers did not twitch. His face did not change. That was almost the problem. Then, for less than 2 seconds, Marco's shoulders lowered. Not much, just enough. The tiny release of a man receiving exactly what he had been waiting for. Sophia felt her stomach sink. He had not been surprised by the bait. He had been relieved to have something to sell. When the meeting broke, Marco moved into the hallway with the slow pace of a man trying not to hurry. His hand slipped toward his phone. Sophia ignored Ren's warning and stepped out before Marco could unlock it. He looked up, and his face warmed instantly with practiced affection. Sophia put the phone down, she said. The warmth held, but only on the surface. Excuse me. The Pilsen address is fake. So is the contact name. Luca gave every person in that room a different lie. Marco went very still. Sophia lowered her voice. Do not send that message. Not unless you want to walk back into that room already condemned. For a moment, the mask stayed in place. Then it collapsed. Marco looked older all at once, as if the secret had been holding his bones upright. The confession came in broken pieces. 4 years of gambling. Loans hidden inside loans. Nearly $400,000. And men who knew his daughter's address and his grandchildren's school. I never wanted anyone hurt, Marco whispered, phone still in his hand. Then tell him that before the next person is, Sophia said. She understood fear. She also knew fear did not erase damage. The warehouse, she continued. 2 men were inside. Marco's face drained of color. They said it would be empty. They lied, Sophia said. Just like you lied to Luca. He flinched. Good, some truths needed to bruise. Go back in there. Tell him yourself. Start with the gambling. Then the debt. Then your family. Marco shook his head. He will never forgive me. Probably not today. Then why are you helping me? Marco asked. Sophia thought of Danny. Of a scared kid with keys in his hand and no clean way out. Because people being used still have to answer for what they did. But they deserve one chance to tell the whole truth before someone else tells it for them. Marco wiped his face with a shaking hand and straightened his jacket. I don't know how to do this. You open the door, Sophia said. Then you stop lying. Through the heavy wood. She listened as he stepped back into the room. She heard the silence when the truth landed. Then Luca's voice. Low and cold. Then Marco's panicked, uneven answers. In the kitchen down the hall. Sophia brewed coffee because she needed something real to hold. When Luca finally entered, the grief in his eyes told her the confession had been worse than suspicion. She handed him a mug. He took it without speaking and drank half before setting it down. 16 years, he said. His voice sounded scraped raw. He was there when Matteo died. He was the first person I called, because he understood what it meant. Sophia leaned against the counter. Tell me, Luca looked up. Defense is gone. 5 years earlier. Matteo had been 28, running an architecture firm and trying to build something clean. A bomb under his car in River North ended it. Sophia's breath caught. Belvita had not been just an attack. It had been an echo. He looked like you, Sophia said softly. Your brother. Luca stared at the coffee. Not at her. He wanted out of all of it, he said. He thought if he built legitimate things, the past would leave him alone. His mouth tightened. I should have protected him. You couldn't. You don't know that. I know you would have if you could. The kitchen held its breath around them. Luca's control cracked. Just enough for the man beneath it to show. When my car exploded outside Belvita. For 1 second I thought it was happening again, he whispered. Sophia moved closer but did not touch him. It didn't. You stepped back. You made me step back, Luca said. You chose to listen, she replied. There is a difference. He looked at her then, and the rawness in his eyes made her chest ache. When Ren told me about the shot at Karina, he said, voice rough, I forgot every plan for 5 seconds. I wanted the whole city bleeding. Sophia held his gaze. But you didn't. Because you told me to think. Because you chose to listen again. He glanced at the faint gray dust still smeared across her apron. If that bullet had moved 1 inch lower, I would be standing in a different world right now. Sophia's voice softened. Then stay in this one. His hand moved across the counter and stopped just short of hers. For all his power. He waited. Sophia saw that. And it mattered. She turned her palm upward. Luca covered her hand with his own. Warm and careful. As if he feared the wrong pressure might break what had finally been given freely. Neither of them said what it meant. Neither needed to. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that two exhausted people had just chosen, in the smallest possible way, not to stand alone. By noon, Marco was gone. Not dead, because Luca had given his word, but removed from the life he had destroyed. Phoenix, a new name. A smaller existence. Sophia remembered Marco saying Luca would never forgive him. Maybe he was right. Maybe forgiveness would take years. Or never come at all. But Luca had still let him live. By 2:00, Sophia was back at Karina, managing prep, when Ren appeared in the doorway. Vuich knows about Marco, he said. He knows the channel is dead. Sophia slowly set down her knife. How long? 24 hours. Maybe less. The kitchen noise seemed to fade. Peace, she was learning, was never the same thing as safety. He's coming directly this time, Ren said. No scouts. No paint, men. Sophia looked around the kitchen at the crew. She had dragged from chaos into something like family. This place had become hers before she noticed. Now it was a target. She called Luca, and he answered instantly. Tell me what you need, she said. I need you to trust me for 24 hours. He replied. I already do. The line went quiet for half a second. That is why this works. But the promised day shrank fast. At 4:47, Ren burst through the front doors, moving too quickly for a man who normally made caution look effortless. We're leaving now. Sophia did not waste time arguing. She stripped off her apron, told Gio to shut down the kitchen, and ran to the waiting car. The staff stared after her, frightened and silent. She hated that they had learned to recognize danger by her face. In the passenger seat, Ren handed her a phone already buzzing. Luca's voice came through at once. The timeline shifted. An 8-man Serbian crew crossed into the city 2 hours ago. They're heading for Karina, not the penthouse. They've been watching you for a week. We let them watch so we could trace them. Sophia gripped the phone. You used me as bait. No, Luca said, voice tight. I used what they were already doing. There's a difference. A thin one. I know, that admission cooled her anger by half. Ren is taking you to a safe house, Luca said. Men I trust are waiting. Stay away from windows and do not make calls. What are you doing? Sophia demanded. He exhaled. I've built an alliance. The Marchetti family controls the Southside docks. The Tran organization runs the lake routes. Neither wants Vuich here. Tonight we cut him out. You're going to the shipping terminal. Silence answered first. Then, yes. How many men do you have? Enough, that is not an answer. His voice softened, and for once he sounded tired of armor. It is the only one I can give you while I'm trying to stay focused. Because of me. Because if I think about that red dot on your chest, I stop being useful. I need you safe so I can think. Luca said, can you do that for me? Sophia stared through the rain-streaked window at the gray city sliding by. People hurried along sidewalks. Taxis pushed through traffic. And none of them knew a private war was about to start near the lake. Yes, she said. Then quieter. Come back. The line held silence. That is the plan. Luca, her voice cracked before she could stop it. Come back. When he answered. The armor was gone. I intend to, he whispered. I have something to finish telling you when this is over. The call ended. Sophia held the silent phone in both hands like it could keep him alive. The shipping terminal on the frozen South Lakefront was all concrete, rusted steel, and wined off the water sharp enough to cut through wool. Floodlights threw hard white circles across stacks of containers. Between them, men moved in silence with weapons held low, because Luca had promised honesty. Sophia knew the outline of the plan. 2 Allied crews would hit the East Dock at 5:22 and force Vuich into the open. What she did not know was that Vuich was already inside cold storage, watching security feeds from a folding chair, calm as a priest. When the first breach came over Ren's radio, Sophia could hear gunfire underneath the static. At 5:51, the radio crackled hard enough to bring Ren to his feet. Sophia stood with him. They found a second Serbian unit in cold storage. He muttered. 8 more. So 16 total, she said. Ren did not answer fast enough. That was answer enough. The plan had been compromised. Then the radio burst again. Frantic this time. Caruso had been hit near the loading cranes. Luca was pinned behind a container with 2 men and no clean exit. Sophia felt the room tilt. Say that again, she whispered. Ren's hand tightened on the radio. He did not translate the next burst. He did not have to. His face had already told her it was bad. Sophia stood frozen in the safe house kitchen. Listening to men fight for their lives through a radio she barely understood. Then Luca's voice came through, rough and breathless. North Lane is blocked. Caruso is down. Move trans crew through gate 4 now. The line went dead. Sophia gripped the table edge until her fingers hurt. Is Caruso alive? She asked. Ren listened to the next code phrase and looked away. That was answer enough. A man Luca had trusted was gone. The cost of the night had become real, not numbers on a board. Then Ren swore under his breath. Vujic is moving, he said. He's trying to walk out with a hostage. This was never only about the terminal, Sophia said, forcing her mind to work through the panic. Ren looked at her, tired and grim. No, it's about who gave the order. The radio hissed again. Vujic had grabbed an injured dock foreman and was using him to cross the terminal floor. Cornered men with power did not beg. They turned other people into shields. Put it on speaker, Sophia said. Ren hesitated. He told me not to. Then explain later. After a long second, Ren obeyed. Luca's voice came through cold and controlled, but Sophia heard the pain under it. Then Vujic spoke. Calm, older, almost bored. You have won the terminal, he said. Do not make me kill a civilian to prove I am still useful. Luca answered with steel. Let him go. Vujic laughed softly. You sound like your brother before he learned men like us do not get clean endings. The words hit Sophia like a slap, and Luca's silence turned dangerous. Vujic kept talking. The real architects were not in Chicago. They were in Belgrade. And 2 money men in Toronto had approved the bounty after Belvita. Killing him would create a martyr and leave the structure intact. Letting him walk, he claimed, would buy names, accounts, documents, and the chain of command. I am offering you the men who ordered the bomb under your car, Vujic said, and the price on Sophia Marino. In exchange, Luca asked. I leave Chicago, Vujic replied. My remaining men leave with me. The foreman walks. Your roots remain yours, and you stop, pretending revenge will bring your brother back. Sophia heard the low, broken breath Luca tried to hide. Vujic had chosen the wound perfectly. On the radio, a second voice groaned in pain. The hostage was still alive. Luca knew the truth. Vujic no longer had enough men to hold ground, but the people behind him still had money and reach. Without the list, another crew could come in 8 months. Another bomb, another bounty. After a long silence, Luca said, 1 hour, terminal floor. 2 men, the foreman leaves first. Documents first, Luca said. Names, accounts, dates, if you lie. This ends differently. Then his voice changed, lower and sharper. The bounty on Sophia Marino is retracted now. Not after the meeting. Now say it. Vujic paused. The room in the safe house seemed to stop breathing. Then his voice came through. The bounty on Sophia Marino is withdrawn. No Serbian crew is to touch her. A second later, another voice gasped, and Ren released a breath. The hostage is clear, he said. Sophia closed her eyes. Relief arrived with grief tangled inside it. She was alive. The foreman was alive. Caruso was not. Nothing about peace felt clean anymore. Is it over? Sophia asked. Ren did not answer quickly. The next hour stretched cruelly. She sat motionless, hands folded so tightly her knuckles ached. Luca's unfinished words circled in her mind. But now they shared space with Caruso's name and the sound of Luca breathing through pain. At 7:41, The radio cracked again. Ren listened, then stood. It's done. Documents are secure. Vuich is gone. Luca is moving. Sophia rose, expecting relief to lift her. Instead, she felt hollow and dizzy. Survival had come, but it had taken someone with it. Is Luca coming here? She asked. He's coming to you, Ren said, 20 minutes. Needing something to do with her trembling hands, Sophia made coffee. She measured grounds twice and still forgot to turn the machine on until Ren gently reached past her. For the first time in 6 weeks, she forced herself to imagine tomorrow. The bounty was gone. She could return to her old apartment. If the landlord had not changed the locks, she could try to pick up the pieces of the life she had left behind. But the thought felt strange, like trying on a coat that no longer fit. She thought of Karina's kitchen, of Gio at the pass, of Luca's hand stopping just short of hers. Then she thought of Caruso, and understood tomorrow would not arrive untouched. The door clicked open. Luca stood there as if the terminal had dragged him through fire and let him keep only stubbornness. His suit was ruined, his hair wind-torn, his arm bleeding through a makeshift bandage. There was soot on his throat and grief in his eyes. Sophia crossed the room before either of them spoke. How bad, superficial. You are a terrible liar. She unwrapped the dirty bandage herself and tied a fresh towel tight around the wound. He let her. That mattered too. Caruso, she whispered. Luca's jaw tightened. Gone, the word fell between them. Sophia touched his sleeve, and he closed his eyes for half a second. You came back cut, Sophia whispered. I came back, he said, but his voice had a hollow place in it now. She looked up, and after 6 weeks, she could read him clearly enough to see the cost behind his eyes. You said you had something to finish telling me. Luca looked down at her hands on his arm. For 3 weeks. I have been trying to find the words. Language is not your problem, Sophia said. You speak 5 of them and use silence as a sixth. A tired smile touched his face, then faded. Then what is my problem? You only struggle with words when they might cost you something. Pain crossed his eyes. You're right. The safe house kitchen went quiet around them. Outside, a car passed on wet pavement. Luca stood in front of her without strategy for once. I bought your grandmother's bakery, he said. The sentence landed so softly that at first she did not understand it. The bank sold it years ago. The last owner defaulted. I found the property history after you told me about it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. His injured hand shook once before he steadied it. The purchase is complete. It will be signed over to you. No conditions. No repayment unless you choose to structure one. Sophia stared at the envelope. Why Luca held her gaze. Completely unguarded. You saved my life, he said. I wanted to give you back a door that should never have been locked. Her fingers moved toward the pocket where she kept her grandmother's old photograph. For a moment, she was 7 again, smelling warm bread. Luca continued. Quieter now. You spent 10 years wearing yourself down in other people's kitchens. Not because you lacked skill, but because survival left no room to fight banks, lawyers and men who profit from delay. Sophia looked at him, searching for the hidden hook. Tell me the rest. He gave a quiet breath. I do not want you to go back to your old life. There it was. His honesty. Not clean, but real, but I won't buy your choice. He continued. Karina, the bakery, the salary, the security. None of it depends on me getting what I want. Sophia studied him until she believed the cost in his face. Luca, she said softly. He stopped. I'm staying. Not because of the bakery. Not because you saved me. I'm staying because I built something at Karina. Because I want the bakery. Because I want a life that belongs to me. And because, for reasons I am still questioning, I want you in it. The relief in his eyes was almost too much to look at. You have the best instincts I have ever seen, he whispered. Do not ruin this by making it sound like a business compliment. He stepped closer, slow enough for her to refuse. She did not. When his fingers touched her cheek, Sophia leaned into his hand like someone who had been cold for years and had finally decided warmth was not a trap. He whispered her name. She lifted one eyebrow. Do not turn this into a speech. A real smile broke across his face, unguarded and almost boyish. For a few seconds, the safe house kitchen became the only quiet place in Chicago. Then the world returned. A soft knock came at the door. Wren entered with the cautious expression of a man carrying too much bad news. Federal Bureau of Investigation wants a debrief tonight, he said. Luca did not look away from Sophia. Tomorrow, Wren nodded, then hesitated. Caruso's wife is downstairs. Luca's face changed. That one sentence pulled him fully back into the life he led. I'll go, he said. Sophia touched his hand once before he left. Protection. She was beginning to understand. Was never as simple as keeping someone safe. Sometimes it meant watching the person you loved walk toward grief because someone had to. When Luca returned, he looked older. Sophia did not ask what Caruso's wife had said. Some pain deserved privacy. Instead, she stood beside him in silence until his breathing steadied. Later, he admitted he had hired an attorney for her 3 weeks earlier. Patricia Holloway. Elite, ruthless, and allergic to intimidation. Sophia stared at him. You had a lawyer for me before I knew I needed one. Optimistically. She shook her head, unable to decide whether to be angry or grateful. You are impossible. Prepared, he corrected. There is a difference. This time. She smiled first. Then she looked toward the dark window. When can we see the bakery? The next morning. The building was smaller than memory. That hit Sophia first. As a child, she had thought it enormous. A whole kingdom of flour, sugar ovens, and her grandmother's singing. Now it stood on a narrow street. A 2-story brick facade with boarded windows and tired mortar. The old green sign was gone, leaving a pale rectangle above the entrance. Luca stood beside her in the morning chill and said nothing. He had learned that her silence did not need fixing. Sophia stared at the second-floor windows, where she had once slept above the smell of bread. Her chest hurt with grief and recognition. It waited. She whispered. Luca turned toward her slightly. What, nothing? But it was not nothing. She could almost see her grandmother painting the green sign by hand. Tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. She spent a week on the sign. Sophia said. Hated every version until the last one. We'll restore it however you want. She looked at him. Do not say that unless you mean exact. Exact, he said. She believed him. The scent of warm bread was not really there, but memory supplied it anyway. Rich and golden and cruel. Sophia touched the boarded door. How long have you been planning this? Luca reached into his coat and brought out a brass key. Since the 3rd day, he said. I had someone run the property history. Sophia stared at him. The 3rd day, back when she was still sleeping in borrowed clothes in his penthouse. When the bounty was 100,000, and she had 11 days before eviction. You barely knew me. I knew enough. He handed her an envelope of photographs. I went inside last week. The structure is solid. It needs cleaning. Some new equipment. Electrical work. But the bones are good. The upstairs apartment is still there. Her fingers closed around the key. The metal was cold and heavy. Luca stepped back. Go in alone, he said. I'll wait here. For 47 minutes. Luca waited on the sidewalk while Sophia moved through the building, behind boarded windows. Inside, dust covered everything. The old counters were scarred. The ovens were silent. Upstairs, the apartment still held the shape of her grandmother's life. Faded wallpaper. An empty hook where an apron used to hang. Sunlight falling across worn floorboards. Sophia cried there, quietly, where no one could see her. Outside, Luca let the cold bite through his coat and thought of Matteo. Then he thought of Caruso's wife. Standing in a hallway with dry eyes because shock had stolen the tears. Rebuilding never erased the dead. It only gave the living somewhere to stand. Matteo had run a legitimate architecture firm for 3 years before a car bomb in River North ended his life. Luca had spent half a decade turning guilt into control because control was easier to hold than grief. Now he stood outside a broken bakery, waiting for a woman who had saved him from the same kind of fire. The symmetry hurt. It also steadied him. He could not bring Matteo back. He could help Sophia build something that would not have to hide from his world. The heavy front door creaked open. Sophia stepped into the morning air. Eyes red, chin lifted. Brass key clenched in one hand. He pretended not to notice the tears. She knew he noticed anyway. "I want to open by spring," Sophia said. Her voice was hoarse but clear. 12 weeks if the contractors don't lie and the permits don't crawl. Luca nodded. "I have contractors." "Of course you do." She wiped one cheek with the heel of her hand. "I'll need 6 months of seed capital. Then it carries itself. We set real terms. A loan with interest. Not a gift." "I know, do not say you know," in that calm voice. "I do know." She glared at him. He accepted it, which somehow made her feel steadier. "I had Patricia draft 3 options," he said. "Choose one, or write a 4th. Sophia stared. "You had options drafted." "Optimistically," Luca said. A reluctant laugh escaped her. Small but real. "You are the most infuriating man I have ever met. I have been told. Also the most prepared." That too, Sophia looked back at the bakery, already seeing work instead of ruin. The contractors arrived that afternoon, and a brutal 12-week battle began. She ran the job site the way she ran a kitchen. No excuses. No vague promises. No disappearing electricians. Luca's builders were excellent, which annoyed her because she wanted at least one reason to complain. In the afternoons, she returned to Karina. She no longer had to stay, but she refused to abandon what she had rebuilt. Gio could run the Karina kitchen alone now, and he told her so at least twice a week. Sophia came anyway. The crew was hers, and people who had been dragged out of chaos deserved not to be abandoned the moment they became useful. 4 weeks into renovations. On a rainy Thursday night, her phone buzzed with Marco's name. She stared at it long enough for Gio to notice. "Bad news?" he asked. "Old news," she said, then answered. Marco's voice sounded hollow. "I know you don't owe me this." I answered. "Didn't I?" Sophia replied. A long silence followed. "I'm in Phoenix," he said. "Luca's arrangements worked." "My daughter doesn't know where I am," Marco continued. "That's how it has to be. But she and the kids are safe." Sophia released a breath. "Good," his voice cracked. "What you did in that hallway. You didn't have to." She looked down the dim corridor outside Karina's kitchen. "You made terrible choices." "Marco, I know. People almost died. One man is dead now because this war kept spreading." "I know," he whispered. And this time the words broke. Sophia softened. "But only a little. The threat to your family was real. I wanted someone to see the full picture. That doesn't erase what you did." "No," he said. "It doesn't." "Then make the rest of your life less cowardly." The next storm arrived in week 7. From a direction Sophia had stopped watching. She was reviewing supplier contracts at the bakery when Patricia Holloway called and demanded an immediate meeting. Patricia did not waste words, and she never used urgency for drama. When Sophia arrived, Luca sat in grim silence. Patricia paced with a file in one hand. "The FBI is building a case using the documents Vuik provided," Patricia said. "One name connects to a federal investigation that began before Chicago. They need a witness to establish the Belvita timeline." Sophia felt her heart slam once. What kind of witness? Patricia looked at her, and the answer was already in her face. "You were there. You served the room. You saw who came in, who left, and what happened afterward." Sophia's hands tightened in her lap. Patricia continued. "If your name enters the public record, the men in Belgrade and Toronto may know who you are within 30 days. Vuic's deal weakened them. It did not make them disappear." Luca's face was still, but Sophia could feel the restraint in him. He wanted to stop this before she heard the rest. "What if I say no?" she asked. "You have that right," Patricia said. "The case can proceed without you. Your testimony makes it stronger." "Not possible." Sophia looked from Patricia to Luca. "And if I say yes?" "Then we prepare you carefully," Patricia said. "We protect your identity where we can. But there is risk." Sophia turned to Luca. "What do you want me to do?" His answer came too quickly. I want you safe. That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters to me. Not to me. The room went quiet. Luca's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. That was how Sophia knew he understood. If he chose for her, even in the name of love, it would become another cage. After a long breath, he said, I will stand beside whichever choice you make. Sophia nodded once. Set up the debrief. She told Patricia. I'll testify. Patricia shifted immediately into professional focus. I need 2 weeks to prepare you. You have one, Sophia said. I have a bakery to open. For 2 days. She sat in a sterile room downtown across from 3 investigators. She spoke clearly. Belvita, the private dinner. The men at the table. Danny's hands. The chemical smell. Luca at the car. Details she had once noticed only to survive now carried federal weight. In the hallway, Investigator Chen stopped her. Off the record, he said, how did you know? The valet. The wire, the timing. You processed it faster than trained agents at the scene. Sophia gave a tired smile. Restaurants teach you to read danger before it has a name. You learn when a room is wrong, Sophia said. When a man is lying. When someone is too still. When someone is about to run. Most people call it instinct. It's really practice. Chen studied her. Useful practice. It got me hunted. It also saved a life and helped break a syndicate. Sophia did not know what to do with that. For years. She had treated her alertness like a burden. Something born from scarcity and long shifts and never having enough room to make mistakes. Now men in suits were writing it into statements as evidence. She left the building exhausted, but lighter than she expected. The truth, once spoken, no longer belonged only to her fear. The bakery doors opened at exactly 7 in the morning. By 7:40, a quiet line stretched down the cold sidewalk. Sophia stood behind the counter, apron dusted with flour, watching the neighborhood step back into a place it thought it had lost. Elderly customers came first, drawn by memory. Younger strangers followed the warm scent of bread and sugar. The ovens roared behind her like a living thing. For a moment, she could not move. The sleepless nights, the eviction notices, the fear, the names of the dead, the numbers that had once ruled her life. All of it had led here in a crooked, brutal line. She touched the counter and whispered, "We made it." Above the entrance, the green sign read second chance in the exact script her grandmother Rose had once painted by hand. An elderly woman stepped forward slowly, one hand pressed to her chest. "I knew your grandmother," she whispered. "I came here every Saturday for 22 years. Sophia swallowed hard and smiled. "Then welcome back." The woman's eyes shone. "Is the bread the same?" "The same recipe," Sophia promised. My hands learned from hers. The woman left with a warm loaf of sourdough held carefully against her coat. Sophia watched her go and felt the bakery settle around her. No longer a memory. Not yet a legend. Just alive again. The morning rush softened into a steady midday rhythm. Her assistants moved easily around the ovens, calling orders over the low hum of customers. When the back door clicked open, Sophia did not turn. She knew that quiet stride. "You didn't tell me it was today," Luca said. "No," she agreed, shaping dough from muscle memory older than grief. "The line was down the block when I drove by. Then you found out." He stood there, taking in the kitchen, the flour on her sleeves, the calm command in her movements. There was a black band around his wrist for Caruso. Sophia saw it and said nothing. "Sophia," he said softly, "look at me." She finished the last roll, set it on the tray, and turned. Luca stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, expression completely unguarded. "I need to tell you something." Sophia leaned against the counter. "You keep saying that." "The federal case," he said 2 days ago. "Arrests were made in Belgrade, this morning. Toronto was raided. Your testimony anchored the timeline. Without it, the documents were weaker." He held her gaze. "The men who authorized the Belvita bombing are in custody. The The ones who changed the bounty are gone too. Your name is off every list we can find. Sophia took a slow breath. Peace arrived so quietly that she did not trust it at first. For years, fear had lived somewhere under Sophia's ribs. This breath felt different, but not untouched. She looked down at her hands, white with flour, dough tucked beneath her nails. Proof of honest work in a morning that had not been stolen from her. Then her eyes moved to the black band on Luca's wrist. Caruso should have lived to see peace too, she said. Luca's face tightened. Yes, no speech followed. No clean comfort. Just the truth. Sitting between warm bread and old grief. After a while, Sophia said, My grandmother would have liked you. She had no patience for men who made decisions for women without asking. I am aware that has been a pattern, Luca said, a faint smile softening the grief in his face. You have improved, she replied. Slightly, only slightly. Do not get greedy. For a moment. They simply smiled at each other across the kitchen, surrounded by warm bread and the quiet miracle of being alive. Then Sophia said, Come out front. It was more than an invitation into the bakery. It was an invitation into the part of her life no one had been allowed to touch for years. Luca sat at a small corner table by the frost-rimmed window. Sophia brought him coffee and warm sourdough. He tore the crust, listened to it crack, and tasted it with unusual seriousness. It's exceptional, he said. I know. He smiled into his cup. Karina, he asked. Sophia sat across from him. I'm keeping it. Afternoons and evenings. Same as before. Mornings belong here. She looked toward the counter. I spent too long living one small piece at a time. I'm done with that math. Show me the other 3 failing properties in your portfolio. Luca stilled. What makes you think there are 3? Because you mentioned losses once. Then change the subject. You only change the subject when the number is ugly. A slow, amazed smile touched his mouth. Monday, he said. Bring files, she replied. They sealed the plan over coffee and bread, while a line formed outside the window again. Her thoughts drifted to the people caught in the wreckage behind her. Danny Reyes, living under a new name. His girlfriend's medical bills quietly paid. Marco in Phoenix, carrying guilt through hot, unfamiliar streets. Mateo, who had wanted to build honestly and was lost to fire. Caruso, whose empty chair would remind Luca that victory still took payment. And then herself, the woman with 11 days left, numb feet, and a tray of dirty glasses, who had still stopped when something felt wrong. Sophia looked at her flour-dusted hands, the rising dough, and the man across from her. Nothing about this piece had been easy. That made it hers. A customer will ask why we're called Second Chance, she said, glancing toward the sign. What will you tell them? Luca asked. Sophia thought for a moment. I'll tell them a woman once lost this place and spent years thinking the story was over. Then one night, she trusted herself when fear told her to stay quiet. Everything after that was harder than she imagined. And some people did not make it out with her. But she kept choosing anyway. Luca's fingers brushed hers across the table. And if they ask what made her choose, Sophia met his eyes. I'll tell them she was tired of letting other people decide what her life was worth. Outside, the line kept moving. Inside, the bread rose. Sophia reached across the table, and Luca's fingers closed around hers. Warm and careful. The terrified waitress with 11 days left was gone. In her place sat Sophia Marino, bathed in the golden light of late March, no longer afraid to claim space in her own life. By saving Luca, she had not been rescued from ruin. She had forced open a future that had been locked away from her for too long. Every scar, every sleepless night, every choice made with shaking hands had brought her here. The bakery breathed around them. Ovens warming, coffee steaming, customers waiting in the bright morning. In the back room, dough rose slowly in the dark, becoming what it was always meant to be. The camera slowly pulls back, leaving them framed by the frost-rimmed window. The city outside keeps moving, loud and restless, but inside Second Chance, the morning holds steady. Sophia is no longer running from what she lost. She has returned to it, rebuilt it, and made room for a future on her own terms. Luca sits across from her, not as a savior, but as the man who finally learned to stand beside her without taking the choice from her hands. Steam rises from their cups. The green sign glows above the door. A black ribbon rests beside Luca's coffee. Small proof that peace still has a cost, as sunlight turns the bakery gold. Sophia smiles, knowing she is not simply safe. She is home.